If you'd been in Havana, Cuba, on the 21st of May 1941, and found yourself standing outside the Colon Cemetery, you would have witnessed a sombre event. A small group of the cemetery's officials, accompanied by 2 European women, went to a pauper's grave and exhumed a body. Having identified the body, they took it to another grave and reinterred it there. That was to be the last resting place of Gerard Lee Bevan, one of the great fraudsters of the 1920s. The 2 women were his daughter, Clara Christabel, and his second wife, Jeanne, who were the only members of his family who'd stayed with him. Gerard Lee Bevan was born just about 1870 with a silver spoon in his mouth. His father, Francis, was to become the chairman of what was later to become Barclays Bank. The Bevans were one of the founding families of Barclays Bank, with the Trittons, the Tukes, and the Gurneys. They were men of property. They lived in Prince's Gate, just north of what is now the Victoria and Albert Museum. And they had 2 country estates, one at Fosbury in Wiltshire, and one at Trent Park, near Tube Station, Cockfosters now. Trent Park is now a campus of Middlesex University. And during the Second War was where senior German prisoners of war were interned. Gerard Lee Bevan was sent, like all the other members of his family, and there were 10 children, to Cheam Preparatory School, and then to Eton, and then to Trinity, Cambridge, where he studied the classics tripos as a contemporary of Stanley Baldwin, the 2 Norman brothers, Montagu, who later became governor of the Bank of England, and Ronald, who became chairman of the BBC, and also his kinsman Theodore Berkeley, who was a noted oar, winning, during his time at Cambridge, the silver goblets at Henley. Bevan himself wasn't a great sportsman. He played sports, he just didn't excel at them. When he came down after a modest degree, not having distinguished himself academically either, he married almost immediately a woman called Sophie Kenrick. She was the daughter of Arthur Kenrick, who owned a metal foundry in West Bromwich and had made good there. He had become a leader in West Bromwich. He was the chairman of the Highways Commissioners who developed the infrastructure around West Bromwich, and he was the leading light of the Liberal Party in West Bromwich. And the Kenrick family had made good. And they had married into the Chamberlain family, and although it isn't known exactly how Sophie Kenrick met Gerard Lee Bevan, one assumes that they met at the house of Joseph Chamberlain, was just by the Bevan House, north of what is now Victoria and Albert Museum. When he came down from Cambridge, just before he married Sophie Kenrick, Gerard Lee Bevan entered the family bank for a trial to see whether he suited banking. Now, this was not an easy time for family banks like the Barclays and the Trittons, because they were in the middle of a movement to amalgamate banks into larger banks. As industry had amalgamated, so industry required larger loans, and the banks had to become bigger so their loan books were big enough to spread risks. And the Barclays had to face the fact that the many provincial banks for which they acted as agents in London were themselves amalgamating, and if they didn't themselves amalgamate with them, they would lose a lot of business. So that life was becoming just a little bit tougher for Barclays, and it was also becoming a little bit more difficult for the Bevans, because as the bank amalgamated, so their influence in the management of the bank waned just a little. So that when Gerard Lee Bevan entered the bank just after coming down from Cambridge, he was on his mettle to prove he could hack it as a banker. Well, in the event he didn't. The family decided that he wasn't up to being a banker and that he shouldn't continue in the bank. The reason isn't recorded anywhere, but a clue may be given by a character reference that was given for him by one of his partners to the Metropolitan Police when he later entered Maidenhead Prison. Because his partner wrote that Gerard Lee Bevan would believe anybody. And the implication is that Gerard Lee Bevan was careless of risk. And at a time when the bank was reorganising itself to merge and become bigger, risk was not what you wanted to take on. One can imagine that this was a bit of a shock for Gerard Lee Bevan. He had a tendency towards arrogance and was full of himself. He certainly thought himself brighter than his brothers, and was probably brighter than most of the other people who became bankers in his day. He'd come to assume that he was entitled to success within the bank, and also felt, one suspects, that he was entitled to be chairman of the bank, just as his father and grandfather had been. So, being told by the family that he couldn't go on was a shock. It isn't that they left him bereft without a solution, because they went to plan B. If you're a nobleman, the second son would go into the army and the third son would go into the church. If you're a banker, the second son went into stockbroking. You see, this was good for the bank. Stockbrokers were good customers. They raised short-term loans with banks, paid good interest on money they used to speculate on the stock exchange. So it was good business for the banking family to intermarry with the stockbroking family to cement the banking relationship and make sure the stockbrokers didn't go elsewhere. And this had already happened to one of Gerard Lee Bevan's brothers, Owen, who had joined Pember and Boyle. Well, the family introduced Gerard into a firm called Edison Company. Now, the name now won't mean very much, but the Ellises had been on the stock exchange from the very beginning. And Ellis was on the general committee when the stock exchange first built itself a trading floor. And throughout the 19th century, they had been prominent members of the exchange. Now, the only good word to describe Edison Company was that it was a stuffy firm. It wouldn't take anything risky. They were too grand for that. They dealt mainly in government stocks. They'd raised loans for the government during the Napoleonic Wars to finance the wars. And that was the sort of business they were happy doing. They certainly weren't intermixing it with the equity stocks that in the 1890s were becoming fashionable. Perhaps they should have thought twice about the Bevan family introducing Gerard to them, because a stuffy firm like Edison Company may not have been a good home for somebody like Gerard Bevan, who was careless of risk, which was why the family decided he shouldn't be a banker, and who resented the fact that his family had turned him over and sent him out to be a stockbroker rather than cementing his career in the bank. He felt he had something to prove. He was out to prove to his family that he could make more money than they could at banking. He started in a quiet way in the 1890s, but within 10 or 12 years had progressed enough to become senior partner of Ellis Company and encouraged the firm to begin to trade in the equities that were becoming fashionable and offering big profits. The Kaffir circus with the South African gold stocks and so on. And they began to make a lot of money. And Gerard Bevan benefited from that with his partners. As he made money, he spent it. You can see that from the houses he lived in. He and Sophie first moved to Connaught Square, now famous because Tony Blair has a house there. But then it was north of Oxford Street. It was to the west of Edgware Road. It wasn't the most fashionable area in London you could live in. So they moved to Manchester Square, which was more fashionable because they moved just when the Wallace collection was opening in Harford House in Manchester Square. And then they bought a lease on a house on the Grosvenor estate in Upper Grosvenor Street. And that wasn't quite grand enough, because they then agreed with the estate to front it with stone. They hired two of the most fashionable architects of the day, who just won the contract to build County Hall. And then another feature of Sophie and Gerard came to the fore. They decided on this distinctive design which had round windows on the second story. A design feature that the Duke of Westminster disliked and didn't approve. At which point Sophie dug in her heels, campaigned against the Duke and won. He gave in. She got her round windows. If you go to look, they're still there. They then converted the stables into garages for houses. And they then went on to fill the house with a collection of the latest artwork and Gerard's particular love, Chinese porcelain. In 1912, Alan Lascelles, who later became secretary to the King and Queen, went there for dinner, having almost by mistake become a clerk at Edison Company. And in his memoirs he writes, it was a place dripping with wealth. Sophie wore the wonderful displays of jewels. The walls in the dining room were full of the latest art. It was conspicuous in the wealth that was on display. All of this was brought to an abrupt stop by the beginning of the First World War in 1914. The city had not expected war, and it certainly hadn't planned for war, and was shocked to discover that remittances between stock exchanges in Europe stopped dead. The result of which was that many stockbroking firms on the London Exchange failed because they couldn't get money to be paid to them by firms in other exchanges in Europe which had bought stocks from London. And yet the London brokers had to meet their obligations with the London Exchange and so failed because they couldn't do it. To stop this contagion, the London Exchange closed, as did other exchanges in Europe. In other words, the gravy train hiccuped and stopped. And the flow of income to Gerard stopped. The exchange opened again in January 1915, but business didn't quite return to its previous levels during the war. And one imagines that Gerard was somewhat embarrassed. He needed another source of income for Edison Company. The solution for him came by way of a chance meeting, a meeting with a man called Clarence Hatchery, who was an insurance broker. The meeting happened I believe, in this way. Hatchery had a partner called Bruce Logan, who was a noted oarsman. And in 1912 he won the silver goblets at Henley, just as Gerard's kinsman Theodore Barclay had done 20 years before, while he was at Cambridge. Theodore Barclay, in winning the silver goblets, had set a record, which had stood for 20 years, until Bruce Logan broke it. Gerard, Theodore Barclay, Clarence Hatchery and Bruce Logan were all present at Henley at the same time, and they met. Now, the fact that they met didn't mean they hit it off together. It's quite surprising they did. Gerard Lee Bevan was an expensively educated aesthete. Clarence Hatchery had an education, but he wasn't an aesthete. Bevan was arrogant, felt entitled. Hatchery had suffered the failure of his father's business and didn't have the same sort of sense of entitlement at all. They shared one thing together. They both wanted to make money quickly and make a lot of it. Bevan, to prove to his family that he could be more successful than them. Hatchery, because he wanted to make good the failure of his father's business and rebuild his father's inheritance. They also shared something else. They both could read balance sheets of companies and understand them and explain them in brilliant words that are well remembered by people who heard them doing it at the time. Hatchery at the time had a plan which had been stymied by the war. He'd seen that many insurance companies in Britain had reinsurance arrangements with German and Austrian companies. He wanted to set up a British reinsurance company which would make money out of selling reinsurance to British insurance companies. When the war started, trading with the enemy was forbidden, and all of the normal reinsurance arrangements with German companies were cut across by wartime regulation. So there was a business opportunity to sell reinsurance exactly at the time when insurance risks were going up because of enemy action. Hatchery had seen an opportunity to buy a small reinsurance company. It was owned by Germans who could no longer manage it. It was called the City Equitable Fire Insurance. And he bought it, reorganised the capital, lent it some money, and it started to make a lot of money very quickly under the management of a man called Mansell, who was its manager. This was interesting to Bevan, who offered to buy it. Now, why should Bevan buy it? Well, the answer is that all a reinsurance company owns is investments to meet its future liabilities to insurance companies. So that the investment portfolio of a reinsurance company offers business to a stockbroker. And that would be a source of business to Bevan. He bought it at what was for Hatchery a profit of $250,000, which was a substantial sum of money in those days. And Bevan had a portfolio of stocks which Edison Company could trade in. It was to prove an extremely important platform for Edison Company's future trading, because Hatchery went on to use the money to buy a bank, Commercial Bank of London Limited, and to use it as a centre for floating new issues of shares. To be successful at that, he also needed a stockbroker, and Bevan became his mate, his friendly stockbroker, who helped him sell shares. A bit of detail about how you floated shares in those days. A company promoter like Hatchery would find a company whose shares might be interesting, and he'd restructure the company so that the shares offered terms that would be interesting to the public. He would write a prospectus and prepare the thing for flotation. He then needed a friendly stockbroker to sponsor the issue to the stock exchange, because the stockbroker was the guy who said to the exchange the rules have been followed. But there was another reason that you needed a stockbroker. The promoter would take his fee, both in terms of cash, but also in terms of shares. He'd take some of the shares being issued, and he'd aim to set the price so that the trading price on the exchange went up after the issue. He would then sell the shares at a profit in the aftermarket, using the broker to do it. The broker would be his agent in managing the share trading price on the exchange. And of course, the broker would himself take shares and make similar profits to the company promoter. That sure was interesting to Mr. Bevan, and saw in Hatchery a man through whom he could make it. Bevan's spending continued. By the end of 1916, he'd added to Upper Grosvenor Street the lease of Littlecote Manor in Wiltshire, which again was filled with Chinese porcelain and all the rest. It's about 80 to 100 acres of the home estate around the house. It was a substantial house for his family. It wasn't his last investment. Hatchery, of course, was spending even more wildly than Bevan. His largest extravagance was a yacht. Bevan's was mistresses. By the end of the war, Bevan was no longer living at Upper Grosvenor Street, although he visited there regularly. He had a permanent suite at the Carlton Hotel at the Pall Mall end of Haymarket, on the site where the New Zealand High Commission building now stands. And there he lived with whichever mistress was the company of the day. And again, they were loaded with furs and jewels and all the rest. He needed money, this man, because he spent it like water. Immediately after the war, Hatchery and Bevan made fortunes together, substantial amounts. But it was too good to last. The stock exchange boom that followed the war stopped because of government action in early 1920. A rise in bank rate, a sharp cut in government spending, what we'd now call the onset of austerity, brought about a collapse in trade, an enormous rise in unemployment, it's the forgotten depression, the depression of 1920, and a sharp fall in stock exchange prices. By 1921, it was no longer possible for Hatchery to make new issues, and the stocks which he and Bevan had hoarded with a view to selling in the aftermarket after issues were way below the loans they'd arranged from banks to pay for them. Bevan suddenly became short of money. Now, what do you do when you're short of money as a stockbroker? Well, one of the things you do is to ask the partners for more capital. Well, he wasn't going to do that. He didn't do it anyway. What he did was to buy insurance companies. He bought 3. He took their investment portfolios and applied Bevan's specialist corporate governance arrangements to them. In other words, he did what he'd already done at City, Equitable Fire Insurance. He got the board to set up an investment committee, which consisted of just 2 people, himself and a friendly solicitor called Grenside. Although there were minute books for these investment committees, there were never any minutes. They never had anything written in them. And when Bevan bought the 3 insurance companies, he got the investment committee to turn the investments into cash, and he used the cash he made out of the newly bought insurance companies to pay off the bank loans. Only there wasn't enough. So his next trick was to put the 3 insurance companies into a new company called City Equitable Associated and offer that company's shares to the public. It was oversubscribed. No surprise, because he first of all showed that the company had very substantial portfolios of investments, although actually by the time the prospectus was issued, all the investments had been sold for cash and the cash paid elsewhere, so there was nothing left. He said that the substantial income that was to be expected by shareholders would be guaranteed by City Equitable, although by this stage City Equitable wasn't making any money because all of its investments had been sold for cash and the cash paid elsewhere to pay off bank loans. In other words, the prospectus that was issued was fraudulent because it claimed that things were not as they were. You can imagine what happened. Sooner or later, the quiescent directors of City Equitable started wondering what was going on. And they started asking questions by about December 1921. They hadn't asked questions before, and you might well ask, why hadn't they? Well, the answer was because none of them was a specialist in finance. None of them knew anything about reinsurance, so all they could do was trust what they were told by Mansell, the manager, and Bevan, the chairman. And they did trust them because they looked kosher, straight-up guys. But as I say, by December 1921, they were beginning to wonder what was going on. And one of them a man called Milligan, sent Bevan a list of questions he wanted to have answered and said that he wanted an independent investigation to get the answers to these questions. In January 1922, Bevan tried to persuade Milligan that he shouldn't start an independent investigation. Bevan knew what the answers would be and didn't like the sound of them. And he gave Milligan some answers which he hoped would keep him quiet. They didn't. Milligan insisted on an investigation. The directors, who were getting very worried by this point, because they were, some of them, very substantial and respectable people. One of them, Sir Douglas Dawson, was the secretary of the Order of the Garter and the Order of Merit. He was a member of the royal household. He was the guy who ran theatre censorship in London. He was horrified at the sorts of things Milligan was accusing Bevan of. So they appointed a chartered accountant called Frederic Van der Linde, a very famous insurance expert, to carry out an investigation. At first, Van der Linde went to Bevan and asked to see a list of City Equitable's investments. And he was given a list. And he said, "What's your problem? Sell the investments and you'll have the money you need." The answer he got from Bevan was, "Perhaps you'd better ask for a more up-to-date list than this one." When Frederic Van der Linde asked for an up-to-date list of investments, first of all, he found it difficult to find. Secondly, when he produced a list with the auditor's assistance, he discovered there weren't any investments left. An outstanding debt due from Mansell, the manager, who, unbeknown to the directors, had been lent money by the company with Bevan's agreement, and a lot of dodgy Hatchery industrial stocks, which were only trading at the lowest prices they'd ever reached. In other words, he discovered that if they tried to sell, there'd be further losses to be made. At this point, the excrement was hitting the fan. People were realising that this was a lousy situation. Bevan knew the writing was on the wall. Frederic Van der Linde advised the directors of City Equitable that there was no hope for the company because all of the investments had disappeared. On the 3rd of February, they applied for winding up. And at this point, the tragedy of Bevan's life was hitting him. Because an awful lot of the investors in City Equitable and City Equitable Associated were his friends and personal clients. He'd ripped off his mates, not just the public. And one imagines he couldn't face looking them in the eye when they realised that their money had been lost. He must also have known that the family, the banking family, would be outraged. On the 8th of February 1922, Gerard Lee Bevan and his current mistress, Jeanne Pertuiseau, left the Carlton Hotel by taxi for Croydon Airport. They took no luggage. They just disappeared. Nobody knew they were going or checking out or whatever the procedure now is. They just left. She muffled in furs, he wearing a heavy tweed coat. At Croydon, they boarded a de Havilland 4 plane managed by Air Instone and flew to Paris. At Paris, they went to Claridge's Hotel, which Bevan partly owned. He was a shareholder. And from Claridge's Hotel in Paris, he phoned a lawyer in London who told him that an arrest warrant had been issued for him. And at that point, Bevan and Jeanne disappeared. In fact, they went to stay with one of her friends in a flat in Paris. A day or two later, he went to have his passport stamped with visas for Greece and Turkey, and he then took an overnight train from Paris to Marseille, where he then travelled along the Riviera to enter Italy at Ventimiglia, and they went to Naples, where they stayed in the Hotel Royal. In Naples, he visited the Spanish consul, who represented the Turkish government, and he applied for a visa to enter Constantinople. The Spanish consul refused and suggested he go back to the British consul in Naples to have his passport validated. He went to the British consul, who had received an instruction from the Foreign Office, who was waking up to the departure of Bevan, and the consul confiscated his passport, as he thought. In fact, he only confiscated the latest page in the passport. Passports at that point were single sheets of paper, which were stamped with visas, and there was an earlier page which was full of visas, which the consul did not confiscate and which Bevan took away with him. By this stage, all hell had let loose in London because people were appalled that Bevan had got away at exactly the point when he was needed in London to explain away what had happened to City Equitable. So he was being chased, partly by the Foreign Office, partly by the police, and certainly by a gaggle of journalists who wanted to find the refugee. Well, Bevan had worked this out. And having realised that he told people enough that they would expect him to go to Turkey, Constantinople and so on, Bevan disappeared and headed for Austria. No one knows exactly how he got into Austria. At his subsequent trial, he said he walked across the border, not at a border town. He couldn't have gone through a normal customs barrier because he didn't have a visa for Austria. He appears to have travelled on a fake passport in the name of Louis Vermier, but however he did it, he ended up in Vienna. Eventually, the police in Vienna got wind of an odd man living there, and eventually they burst in and surprised Bevan. When the police arrived, Bevan took out a white pill, tried to take it. The police thought it was a suicide pill, took him to a hospital, had his stomach pumped. They probably thought it served him right anyway, and put him in prison, not knowing exactly who he was, because by this stage Bevan had grown a beard and had it dyed and didn't look like his original photograph. It took 2 days with Bevan until he gave in, said who he was, called for a barber and had his beard shaved off. And at that point, extradition proceedings began. But again, the journalists were there, and they not only were there for the extradition proceedings, they followed him all the way home on the train. 4 or 5 months later, at his trial, he was found guilty of fraud and imprisoned for 7 months. The judge was Horace Avery, who appeared in one form or another in every major fraud trial up to about 1935, after 1900. He always seems to have delighted in finding appropriate words to force guilty people into prison, and this occasion he bemoaned the fact that a man of Bevan's education and breeding had come to such a pass, and it gave him great sorrow to pronounce his normal maximum sentence on Bevan. Bevan went off to Maidenhead, where he was prison librarian. His prison file can still be found, as can the list of people who visited him, and it's sad. His family had totally deserted him, apart from Christabel, his daughter. None of his brothers visited him, and if you compare the record of his visits with those for others, he was a very lonely man by this stage, isolated. Sophie divorced him. Jeanne stayed by him, and when he came out of prison in 1928, she married him. At that point, Bevan disappears for a few years. In 1931, Jeanne and Bevan went to Havana, and there, in what may seem like the ultimate degradation, he found himself working as an accounts clerk and manager for Mill Creek Distillery. The records of Mill Creek Distillery no longer exist within the island of Cuba, but curiously, the company's name survives in tax litigation in America, because it was owned by a man called Leon Gleckman, who was known as the Al Capone of St. Paul, Minnesota. And it appears that Mill Creek Distillery in Cuba was used as a money laundering route for Gleckman, who made his money selling bootleg whiskey to people during the Prohibition era in St. Paul, Minnesota. Bevan ended his days working for the mob in Cuba, counting their money. In Cuba, there's no memorial to Gerard Lee Bevan. Although he has a permanent resting place, there's no memorial to him on that resting place. There's an entry in a register. And there's no memorial to him in the UK either. There was one way, in which his name was, for very many decades, well remembered by lawyers. At his trial, the jury, in finding him guilty, added the rider that he wouldn't have got away with anything like so much had the directors of City Equitable not discharged their duties better. Sir Horace Avery took no account of that in finding a sentence and said he had no power to do anything about that at all. But the liquidator of City Equitable acted on it. He sued the other directors of City Equitable and tried to get the court to order them to pay damages to the company for failing to discharge their duties as directors. The name City Equitable Fire Insurance became the name of the landmark case, which in British company law settled the standard of care that directors had to discharge. In the end, to the great relief of the directors, I have to say, the judge, Mr. Justice Reimer, found that you could only expect of directors the standard of care of reasonable men. You can't expect a standard of care of people specialist in finance. With that explanation, all of the directors got off, and they paid nothing towards the failure. As I say, this was a great relief to such as Sir Douglas Dawson, although if you read his memoirs, you will find how bitter he was. The company law had left him exposed. The only other memorial to Bevan was written by John Galsworthy. In the Forsyte saga, his book, The Silver Spoon, is based on the story that I've just told you. Other than that, Bevan is not remembered at all. Certainly, the Bevan family tried to move away from him. It's a sad story, in the end, of a man whose expectations came to nothing because he was careless of risk and knew no limits in trying to make the money he needed to prove to his family that he was better than they thought he had been. He was wrong.